What is up, everyone? I hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to another Web Dev Junkie video. My name is Cody Cyber, and in this video, what I'm going to show you is how to upload to an S3 bucket from your UI. So let me just give you a little demo, and then we can kind of dive into how I did this. So I have a UI here, which just has a form with an input of type file, and I could select a file from my computer. So I'll just select a picture that I have called Carbon, and when I submit it, this is actually going to do two things. The first thing it does is it hits my local running HTTP server to get a pre-signed post URL. And using that pre-signed URL, you can actually upload files directly to your private S3 bucket. So when I click submit, you'll see here in the network tab, it does a get signed URL. And then it also does a request to the bucket. So now at this point, if I go back to the bucket and dive into it and refresh, you'll see that we have a UID, which is actually the image we just uploaded, and we can download it. So if I click it and say download, we got the image back. Okay. So you might not really know why this is important, but if you're dealing with S3 and files, it's kind of important to know how to upload images directly from your browser to S3 for performance reasons. So if that is something that you're interested in sticking around for, be sure to stay tuned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the UI first of all, and I'm going to show you the first request it makes, which is called a get signed URL that it's going to call. So let me zoom in a little bit here. So it makes a request to get signed URL, which is hitting a local running Express service that I have, okay? So let me go to the code first and kind of walk you through it. On the front end, I have a form with an input and a button. And when I click submit on that button, we are basically just grabbing that input field, getting the file that was attached, and we are setting up some form data. But before we use that form data, we hit our Express endpoint here. You can probably see where it does this fetch request to localhost 8080 get signed URL. And what this is actually doing is pretty much checking my credentials and making sure that I have access to upload to the S3 bucket. So in this tutorial, I don't really have a authentication system set up. Anyone can upload to this bucket if they get the pre-signed URL, but you can take it a step further to kind of secure that, to make sure that a person has a particular role or they have a particular like user ID, etc., so that only certain people can upload to that bucket from the front end. So now that I showed you this part, so it tries to get the pre-signed post URL, let's show you the backend. So on this index.js file, I have your typical Express service, where I bring in a couple of packages such as like AWS. I set up an S3 object to kind of be able to call the create pre-signed post method, and yada, yada, yada. You should be familiar with Express. If you're not, you should probably not even be watching this tutorial. But down here where I set up the endpoint, I say set up a get endpoint at get signed URL. So then when our front end hits this endpoint, we basically say, hey, we need to create a pre-signed post URL for this user. And we have a couple of conditions and keys set up. So the first thing we set up is a key. So that's just generating a random UID so that we don't like overwrite existing files. And we don't want the client to allow to like send in whatever keys they want, because they could potentially overwrite files as well. So we just generate a new one, and it's going to be pretty much mathematically impossible to overwrite anything that's existing. So that's why I'm using a UID. And then we also have a couple of conditions. So this condition makes sure that they only upload images in this case, but you could change this to be whatever you want, like PDFs or MP4s, MP3s, etc. And then we also specify a max length. In this case, 1 megabyte is the largest image they can upload to my backend, or else it'll throw an error. And then you can also specify how long this pre-signed URL will last for. So in this case, I say you have 30 seconds. Once I send you back this URL, you got 30 seconds to actually upload that image, or else you're not going to be able to do it. And this kind of prevents maybe a potential hacker from grabbing your pre-signed URL and uploading stuff as well. But I mean, there's probably ways to hack it anyway. If someone has access to get that token, they might have access to other stuff. And then finally, we say what bucket do we want to create this pre-signed post URL to, and that's called Cody's Awesome Bucket. So once you call all this, it basically returns you some JSON back, and we're just sending that back to the client here. So let me show you what that looks like. If I click on get signed URL over here and I go to preview, you'll see that we get back a URL in that property, or in that payload, which is the full URL to the S3 bucket. So S3 whatever / Cody's Awesome Bucket. And then we have some fields. So all these fields are kind of necessary for S3 to kind of validate that you do indeed have access to upload a file to this bucket. You can read up more about these, but you need to basically use these on the next step where you try to upload to the S3 bucket. So now if we go back to the UI code, after you get that pre-signed URL, you can basically set up some form data. So I'm just saying, set up data here. We got the bucket. We got all the fields that came back from that pre-signed post. We are specifying a content type, which will basically be whatever we put into the input file element. And then we are attaching the file. So bear with me, this is all just like hacky code. It's not like elegantly written. I'm just doing it to prove a point or to show you a point. And once you have that form data, I basically just wrap it in a form data object and just append all those fields in. And then finally, we can do a post request to that URL that was sent back from us on the original pre-signed post URL with some post data here. So this one should make sense. We basically just set up all this data in URL so that we can then send the file over. So at this point, if you click on this request and go to headers, you will see down here, all those fields that came back with our pre-signed URL are put into the form data. So you see we have bucket, we have key, and we have all of these additional things that are kind of for securing and validating that I have access to upload something to the bucket. And some caveat to this is that the file actually needs to be the last thing in your form. So make sure you have the file appended last. And at this point, if you are successfully uploading, you'll notice that you get a 204 no content, meaning that it's a new file that wasn't there, and then, S3 accepted it, and we got a green circle, so we're good to go. So like I showed you in the demo before, if I go back to this bucket, we have a single file, which happens to be that image that we originally selected and uploaded from our UI. But yeah, that is the gist of what we're trying to do. This is, again, a private bucket. So the only way you can have someone upload to a private bucket is by using that method. Now, if you go to the SDK, this is the SDK docs. Let me zoom in a little bit. So if you go to the SDK, this is basically where they kind of tell you, what you can pass into that create pre-signed post. It's, again, not too many options you can pass in. You can pass in conditions, fields, and expires, and bucket, which are the things that I passed in this example. So there's really not much else to read up on. Maybe the conditions you can kind of dive into and see like what exactly can you do with these conditions to make sure that people only upload a particular file of a particular size with a certain key and stuff like that. But it's pretty cool. So that is how I pretty much set up a UI to be able to post a file to a private S3 bucket. If you found this interesting, be sure to give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment below if you have any comments or suggestions or questions about this approach. And also be sure to subscribe if you're new to this channel. All right, y'all, this wraps it up. So thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Happy coding.